Welcome to the third session of this webinar series jointly organized by FES India and Prajna on gender and the changing world of work. We're just delighted to be able to do a panel on gender migration and work. Migration, gender, work are all independently of interest to Prajna and also to FES. And this year, I think, has put a spotlight on the issues more than ever before. And if you never thought about it, then you certainly started thinking about it earlier this year. I'm actually going to disappear shortly. But before I do, I want to hand the session over to my friend, Sudarsana Kundu. And I'm going to introduce her. Sudarsana is currently the co-executive director for Gender at Work Global, where she is working with a range of organizations to drive institutional change for advancing gender equality and women's empowerment. Through her work leading UN Women's programs on gender and governance, she has worked with governments and CSOs across the globe, providing recommendations on enhancing service delivery for women. She's advised numerous organizations on developing strategies that ensure public and private sector actors have a stronger social and economic impact, particularly with respect to gender equality. Over to you, Sudarsana, and thank you so much, Sudarsana, and all the panelists for being here today.
Thank you, Swarna. I'm so excited to be here, and I'm really here to learn from this amazing panel that we have today. We have a great lineup today. So as Swarna mentioned, today, all of us remember those thousands of migrant workers walking home. But that migrant crisis that we witnessed was not only because of COVID. It has its genesis somewhere around more deeper structural issues that were brought about by forces of globalization, by neoliberalism, through those technological changes, and pre-existing societal inequalities of caste and gender. So today, this panel, with the help of these wonderful panelists, will delve a little bit more to understand the linkages between gender and migration and work, especially in the context of urbanization, which brought those millions of rural workers and their families to these large agglomerations. Before I move on to introducing our speakers, just a few logistic notes. Just in terms of the structure, we'll start with an introduction of the speakers, which will be followed by inviting the speakers to share some thoughts. We'll do that for about 30 minutes. This will be followed by some questions on the ideas and that they have shared, which will be about another 20 to 30 minutes at most. And then we'll open it up to the audience. So what we would like to invite you to is to first, as you're hearing from everyone, please share your thoughts, your opinions, comments on the chat box, and as well as do write your questions on the chat box. We'll collate them at the end and then relay it to the speakers. And we really want to make this as engaging and and inviting you to also join in as much and participate as much as possible. So before we start, I'd love to introduce our speakers. Let me start with Gayatri Menon. Gayatri is an associate professor at Azim Premji University School of Development. She's a sociologist by training. Her work focuses on urbanization, displacement, and questions of home. She also has extensive experience in the nonprofit sector. She's worked on rural livelihoods and indebtedness in Maharashtra, on agricultural practices and politics in Garhwal, on land tenure and housing rights with a global network of women's groups, and she currently serves on the board of IT for Change. Her publications include a co-edited book called Accumulating Insecurity, Violence and Dispossession in the Making of Everyday Life, as well as essays on the politics of microcredit, livelihoods, land tenure, and citizenship. She's currently completing a book on the lives and histories of pavement dwellers in Mumbai. Welcome, Gayatri. And then we have Indrani Mazumdar. Indrani Mazumdar retired this year as a senior fellow at the Center for Women's Development Studies, New Delhi. Her research focus has been on gender, labor, and migration. She has published a book on women workers and globalization in India, and has several articles and book chapters and written extensively on the issues of on women, labor, and migration, including as a lead researcher on one of the multi-state CW studies on gender and migration. She has been associated with an in-depth study in rural Orissa, co-edited the review of women's studies on gender, labor, and constitution in the Economic and Political Weekly. Previously, she was the General Secretary of the Association for Women's Studies, and now is currently an ex officio member of its executive committee. And our third panelist for today is Karen Coelho. Karen Coelho is an anthropologist. She's an associate professor at the Madras Institute of Development Studies in Chennai. And she's researched the city of Chennai for over 15 years, focusing on critical examinations of urban infrastructure projects, including housing and resettlement schemes, informal settlements, and mobilities of working class households. She has written and published articles on life and work in these resettlement colonies of Chennai, and more recently on the politics of eco-restoration of rivers, canals, and tanks in Chennai. She serves on the editorial advisory board of the Review of Urban Affairs of the Economic and Political Weekly. So as you can see, we have just an amazing, brilliant set of speakers today. And without further ado, I'd like to start us off. And Indrani, I'd like to start with you. You've studied the situation of women migrant workers in India from a in depth and from a historical and economic perspective. What are the broad characteristics and patterns of women's labor migration in India? And if you could speak a little bit to the structural issues or factors that you see are influencing migration patterns of women in relation to their work. So Indrani, over to you.
Okay, so thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak on something about which one has been, with which one has been engaged for now more than a decade. I mean, I thought that I would start with just giving a little overview of the broad patterns of migration. And I have to say that when we started our work on migration, there were several other factors which I won't go into, but one of the key points before us was this strange paradox that you had, where you had a falling work participation rate amongst women and a really growing gendered employment crisis. And on the other side, you had an increased rate of migration also. So you had this paradox situation of falling work participation rates and increased rates of migration. But that is a paradox which will stay with us. And since India is a very large country, and obviously it has, for every single trend that you find in any location, you can find a counter trend in another location. So that's the broad context in which we have to look at even what we consider to be trends as far as things are concerned. Now, usually when one wants to look at, develop any, have an overview of migration, one would go first to the macro data sets which are available in census, and at least till 2007-8, the National Sample Survey, which is of course now called the NSO, whatever. But the moment you start looking at the data sets, and especially when you want to bring in the gender dimension, you're immediately confronted with a whole range of problems. Now, the first problem is, of course, that when the surveys on in census and the NSSO, when they ask about migration or the reason for, they ask for one reason, only one reason. And as we all understand, women's lives are embedded in a much more complicated social structure. Women are rarely completely independent individuals taking decisions. So there is, I mean, when you ask for one reason, most of them will say we migrated for marriage, or we migrated with the family, or there will be social reasons that they will give. So that they may be also migrant workers doesn't come to the forefront because they're asking only one reason. So the monocausal framework of the surveys poses a problem as far as women's labor migration is concerned, and it leads to a distinct underestimation and overemphasis of the social, and an underemphasis and an underestimation of the numbers of women migrant workers in the country, in different, both in rural as well as urban. But on the other side, when you look at economic, those who are officially migrating for work, this, sorry, I should mention that this is one reason. Then when you look at the data, the pattern emerges quite clearly. Now, what it emerges is that there's an extraordinary female bias to the demographic data on migration, largely because of the widespread practice of village exogamy, where the woman will have to marry within her own caste and community, but she has to marry outside her village. That's a pretty widespread, and in fact, as we found, it is actually spreading much more. The practice of village exogamy is becoming more entrenched and widening its ambit even into tribal societies where it was not necessarily the practice earlier. So because of that, almost every married woman in rural India definitely is counted as a migrant. So you have a female bias in the demographic data, and as you know, for census 2000 and in census 2001, it was around 60% of the all total migrants were female, and in 2011, I think it was around 58%. But you see, you have a distinct female bias. On the other hand, when you look at the economic migration, you have an extraordinary male bias. And so you have, it varies between 80 to 85%, 87 to 85% across the two censuses. Now, this is a problem. Now, long-standing tendency, especially amongst economists, has been to therefore look at only male migration when it comes to trying to analyze economic processes and development processes. Now, to my mind, the complete neglect of gender in this was partly because of this problem. Because let me say that you cannot disentangle these things very easily. You know, when we started our work, we said, oh, after migration, work participation rate increases a lot. So therefore, there must be, you know, much more female migration. But that's an erroneous point, because in a village, if a woman is in her husband's village, working on the family farm or working at home in that village, completely immobilized, not going anywhere outside, would you consider her to be a migrant worker? She's a worker. She's also migrated. So it's not easy. You can't disentangle the whole thing quite simple. People do tend to try to do it because they would like to focus on female migration, but it doesn't help us in actually arriving at any kind of serious estimation. But leave that aside. The point of fact is that even though these underestimations and overestimations exist as far as the data is concerned, it is no getting away from the fact that there is a male bias to the labor migration pattern in India. And what I'd like to emphasize in today's discussion is that it is a question that we need to address if we wish to understand the political economy of migration in India and how it is playing out in several ways. First point is I'd like to say that if you have it's a historical this. If you have a male migration, a bias towards male, a predominantly male labor migration pattern, then that has allowed for an extraordinarily low wage accumulation regime to survive. And it must be understood that capital is not, in its wage payments to its workforce, is not paying for the full reproduction or the survival of the family of the worker. So there is a subsidy and there is an aspect of social reproduction or the production of the workforce itself, which is outside that wage economy of capitalist accumulation. And this must be understood by us, because when we look at the relationship between urban and rural India, in terms of the people who actually construct this entire relationship in the workforce, and when we try to understand how gender plays a particular role in this, then we have to address this particular aspect. And let me say that this is not an unchanging scenario. I mean, a broad pattern of low wage capitalist accumulation, an accumulation regime based on low wages, which does not support the survival of the families of the working class. This is, of course, a long-standing. It has been there for a considerable period. Of course, there were legislations and policies which sort of attempted to counter it to a limited extent, and to some extent this was possible in organized sector, industrial industries, etc. But it's not just this thing. But in the neoliberal era, in the current phase of a changed policy regime, you are now in a situation where you have both this low wage and an aggravated low wage, because wage rates are falling and wage shares in industry have fallen pretty drastically in the last across the last decade, and this has been pointed out by Ravi Srivastava. But I'm saying that is, you have an aggressive accumulation regime based on further lowering the wage at one level, and you have an agrarian crisis where there is a greater dependence on the money incomes that are coming from the from migrant workers in non-agricultural sectors. Now, this pincer-like situation has had a very devastating effect on women, and particularly in terms of women's employment. And I sometimes have a bit of a problem with, sort of an easy division between social reproduction and production, because in the overall social and economic relations in India, you have a sort of an interrelationship between the two. And you can't always rigidly define it in terms of unpaid and paid. You equate production with paid and social reproduction with unpaid. Doesn't work, is the same. You will have unpaid labor in production also, and you have this aspect is also there. And what we have seen in recent years is that it is not just unpaid, it is not just paid labor or income generating work of women, which has taken a beating in rural India, because let me say rural employment rates for women have really fallen, but it has also affected the unpaid work, their unpaid work in production. They're being evicted from the production boundary at a rate which is extraordinary and is causing a certain situation. It is affecting gender relations within the family, in social life, because if women are not bringing in money, men are bringing in money, women's work is getting devalued, you have a certain disturbance in the equations that have historically evolved in terms of a certain balance of even consumption and access and rights within the family. Okay. Now, having said this, I also would like to say that when we actually look at women's migration, and then again we see a tendency to focus on independent women's migration. Those who are migrating as individuals or in groups of women, etc. Now, my understanding of the entire thing, and since I've been engaged with it for quite some time, one has a certain instinct which is grows over time, is this is not more than 25%. There's 75% of embedded, socially family embedded migrant women workers. And their issues have hardly seen the light of day. And many of them are working in the wage economy. Now, obviously, there's I haven't referred to the fact that the general approach to migration is to look at it as rural to urban and a process of urbanization. But that's not the only pattern in India. We have a large amount of circular migration. We have, and I would say that there is only a relatively smaller proportion of the urban migrant workforce is of the urban working class is completely disembedded from its rural setting. And that's because of the nature of the whole system. But I'm saying that when you look at the issues of married women, right? For example, if you take brick kilns, now that's very much part of the wage economy. It's very much
Indrani, you'll have to start wrapping it up.
Workers are working. Yeah, I'll just wrap it up because I just want to point out this particular issue which does not receive the adequate attention. And that is, you see that the woman is not an independent worker in this. She's a part of a family unit. And so when you have wage regimes where the recruitment is of a family unit, not of individuals, and it is combined with piece rates, effectively women get denied any kind of independent wage. Now, again, this is a very complex issue. It doesn't mean that, you know, you suddenly say, no, everybody has to get an independent wage, because then the whole, I mean, if you have to work within a regime which is pushing the wage down, and you have to try and lift the wage. So it's a complicated process. But this issue has hardly been addressed by almost any of the discussions around migrant workers. And I believe that it is a particularly important issue. The second point is I just want to make that when you have a male bias into migration, it means that your labor market is constructed by this predominantly male workforce. And it means it creates a certain hostile environment for entry of women into non-agricultural.
Thanks, Indrani. I don't know if it's
and then let's
we'll come back to some of these. We'll come back to some of these issues. Is it just me, or Indrani's voice is breaking? No, I think it's Thanks, Shakti. So, Indrani, you've kind of pointed so many of these really interesting points about the way that the wage accumulation, the model of the capitalist economy, in terms of actually, it does not take into account the subsidy that the women is actually bringing, and kind of really, it does not take into account the cost of a family moving into the urban spaces, or other migration, or other rural migration as well. And also our own imagery has always been this rural to urban migration, and you point out that it's really not. There are so many different cycles and stages and forms of migration that exist in India. I'd love to speak to Gayatri about this identity of the women as a migrant, because Indrani also mentioned about this entire village exogamy. The context of the woman is very different. It's very socially embedded in her, and it's different for different migrants, right? How are you seeing this migrant identity shape the experiences of women, and possibly in the urban settlements that you are studying? And in relation to that, as Indrani has said, that has bearing on their ability to work in this productive work. What are you seeing, and what are you seeing in terms of their relationship to work and their own experiences as a migrant?
Okay, thanks Sudarshana, and thank you Prajna and FES for inviting me to be part of this panel and to contribute to this very timely discussion. Indrani's presentation was so comprehensive that she's a very tough act to follow. And in many ways, what I'm trying to do in my presentation is really just to emphasize and extend some of the points that Indrani has already raised with respect to this gender migration and work nexus. So in responding to the question that you've posed regarding migrant identity, particularly that of women, I think it's important for us to spend a little time dwelling on the question of who is a migrant. Something that Indrani has already kind of gestured at, right? And what is distinctive about women's migration experiences before proceeding to untangle the relationship between women, work, and migration. So before addressing what is understood, to be labor migration, right, where employment is articulated as the impulse driving migration, it's necessary to acknowledge that most migrants in India, as Indrani pointed out, are women. And indeed, most women are migrants, right? The institution of patrilocal marriage means that most women live their adult lives in villages and towns and neighborhoods that they did not grow up in. And the statistics and scholarship bear out the fact that the primary and predominant reason given for female migration is marriage. Now, this is a fact that I think, and as Indrani's already pointed out, can do with some complication. So to that end, there are a couple of different points that I want to make. They're not terribly novel, but they are important in understanding the socio-spatial relations that locate women in a relatively disadvantaged position in the household, in the household's livelihood operations, and more widely in the labor market. So the first point, right, is, and again, treading on ground that Indrani's already covered on, which is that let's take this idea of marriage as migration. Right? What this spatial characterization of a commonplace social institution does is it allows us to highlight the diminished social capital that typically accompanies a woman's entry into a marital home and into the sphere of the productive and social reproductive labor that is constitutive of her marital home's livelihood. Now, marriage migration is part of a socialization process that reproduces the low bargaining power and autonomy of women migrating from her natal to her marital home. And arguably, it doesn't just reproduce this disadvantaged position, it also amplifies it given the distance from her usual sources of support. And this is not just in terms of her position as daughter-in-law, but also in terms of her as a laboring subject within the household and in workplaces outside of it. So to recognize marriage as migration is an important step towards understanding the disadvantageous bargaining position that women typically occupy. And, you know, I think when we say, when we, you know, quickly glide over the issue of women being migrants only because they stipulate marriage as the motivation, right? What it obscures from view is women's control or lack thereof of her labor in her marital home, because and why does she lack control, right? Primarily because she is perceived as being from elsewhere. So patrilocality and the attendant migrant status that it bestows on married women creates a situation where her ability to lay claim to family resources and assets to which she has contributed through her productive and her social reproductive labor is largely negligible. Right? Many scholars have pointed out that the negligible asset positions of women within the household actually contribute to the making of a gender-based class division in the labor market. So they also lack control over their time, which further circumscribes the kinds of employment they seek. Women's motivations to seek waged work outside their homes derive from many reasons, and earning a wage is only one, albeit an important one, because what they're trying to do is in multiple kind of through multiple strategies is to change their situations both inside and outside the home. So understanding this thicket of social and spatial relations shaped by patriarchy and capitalism is critical to understanding the kinds of struggle women as laboring bodies choose to invest in. So, and again, you know, I appreciate the fact that, you know, the panel today is largely focusing on rural to urban migration, but I think, you know, probably the most egregious example of the lack of women's autonomy over her own laboring body was probably, for example, the mass hysterectomies of migrant sugarcane cutters in Beed district in Maharashtra just a short while ago, right? So again, it's a really powerful way in which to try and understand this kind of lack of autonomy over your bodily autonomy, right? So the social spatial theme that I'm kind of outlining, right, by making by positioning marriage as migration, and what I've traced out with respect to patrilocality and the question of belonging that it raises is also one that we see in rural to urban migration, right? And indeed, what we typically recognize as labor migration as distinct from demographic mobility. So this question of not belonging, which identifies migrant bodies, is one that hovers around the urban poor as they contend with tenurial insecurities that extend from their informal shelters in which they house themselves to the cities in which they have migrated to. And indeed, this is what the fight for the right to the city is all about, right? Their identification as migrants, and in particular, as populations who are compelled to house themselves under precarious tenurial conditions, and therefore whose claim to a right to the city is always kind of up in, for question, is one that puts them in a distinctly disadvantageous position, whether it has to do with their negotiations around access to toilet and water, right? Or it has to do with their ability to negotiate fairness and demand accountability in the job market. In multiple ways, even you know, populations that have spent you know, a couple of generations in the city will always be defined as migrant, primarily because of where they stay, right? Of course, it is also because of the languages they speak. In Bangalore, for example, people who migrate here, domestic workers who migrate here and speak Tamil, are able to be a part of the kind of, or be seen as belonging in ways that are not afforded to populations that don't speak Tamil or Telugu or Kannada, right? And I think one of the things that most migrant workers do is when they come to the city is working either as domestic workers, or they're in manufacturing, or in care, in other kinds of care service industries. So when we consider the settlements in which rural to urban migrants find themselves, there's a really interesting and important dimension to gender dimension to this. Yeah, and what that has to do with the fact of where women migrants look for work and when they can look for work. So in these poorly serviced settlements of the urban poor, the daily responsibilities of provisioning the household typically fall on women, right? And the point that I'm trying to make here is that because you have to source water, because you have to source childcare, right, in ways that are quite distinctive in urban settlements, this also spatially circumscribe the work options for women, right? Those who are, they're typically compelled to find work that allows them to source, to do these kinds of care responsibilities, depending on when the water tanker comes or when a particular tap opens, right? So the kind of these, of course, these tenurial insecurities are at this particular political moment amplified by the kinds of political insecurities that different communities also face, right? Now, in the post-COVID situation, or not post-COVID, the COVID situation, this kind of space-based discrimination is also an important thing to consider, right? Especially when you're looking at domestic workers. So, for example, in Bombay, and I'm just going to wrap up now, right? The informal settlements are busy being cordoned off, right? And your identity as a worker is also defined by where you live. And that shapes the kinds of opportunities that you have in terms of the kinds of work that is possibly available to you, right? So just focus, what all I was trying to do in this kind of presentation was to kind of bring out the spatial dimensions of this.
And thank you so much, Gayatri, for bringing out the spatial relationships that influence, in a way, the access to work and what kinds of work that that women can actually take. And it's a really good in terms of, because Karen, and also this kind of thing about, you mentioned it again, talking of rural to urban, and then we also talked a little bit of the rural to rural migration. You mentioned that about the beat workers. Karen, I'd like to come to you, because you've kind of talked, while these rural to rural happen and there's urban to urban, but you've worked a lot about looking at intra-urban kind of relocalization, right? And these spatial relationships that those generate. So can you say something about those movements and migration of households within the city? Gayatri had already started about how, in terms of there are spatial cordons that are now happening, right? How have these relocation of working class families as urbanization happens are pushing families to the outskirts? How have these restructured women's work opportunities?
Thank you. So yeah, thank you. Thank you to Prajna and Sudarshana, and also to the previous two speakers, Indrani and Gayatri, because I think, this is a very neat sort of progression of looking at how women have moved from rural to urban areas, which you talked about, Gayatri, and I'm talking about how they've been pushed out of urban areas into peri-urban areas, and to look at what that has implied for, so everyone can hear me, right? Okay. So I actually think that this new sort of spatial restructuring of our cities is forging a new moment in the history of the urban women's working lives, which has brought very severe and stringent new challenges, I think, causing very large numbers of women to drop out of the workforce, to stay home, to work less, or at best to reinvent their working lives. I think this new spatial politics of India's metro cities are restructuring the gender politics of India's urban working classes, either by eliminating a large number of working class women from the labor force, or by causing what I'm calling a domestication of working women, even within their working spaces, through the kinds of work they're doing and through the conditions of their work. And I think this resonates with other studies of gender and work in recent times, like Anandi and Karen Kapadia talked about. Even as larger numbers of women are entering the workforce and becoming often the principal household wage earner, their conditions of work are increasingly exploitative, with precarious working conditions, ever tightening surveillance and control over women, both in their workplaces and especially for young unmarried working women, even at home. And to the extent that job turnover and dropout are quite frequent because of these working conditions. Now here I'm arguing that if we put these emergent conditions of women's work together with the spatial restructuring of our cities, we see new profiles of women's work emerging. So let me say just a little bit more about these spatial restructurings. Over the last 2 decades, we are seeing a trend emerging and consolidating across Indian cities, which is a mass dumping of slum dwellers or the urban working poor in peripheral resettlement tenements. In other words, the predominant mode of low-income urban housing and of slum clearance has become resettlement in large housing projects on the urban peripheries. Now, there are a few things to mark about these projects. First, the scale. These colonies house several thousands, from about 5,000 to about 25,000 or more families, often of a single caste class stratum, typically EWS. Usually large proportions are SC, ST or OBC, often minorities in cities like Ahmedabad or Delhi. And these tenements are usually provided fully built up with a very small size, from maybe 150 to 350 square feet. And of course, they're located on the edges of the city or miles outside, often in isolated wastelands, poorly connected to the city, often near municipal dump yards or industrial backyards. This is kind of a, you could say, a nationwide metropolitan scenario. And now, while these projects are built in the name of affordable housing, slum clearance, formalization of informal settlements, numerous studies are finding that they are poverty traps, in which the cycles of disadvantage that perpetuate urban poverty are reproduced and exacerbated by distance and disconnection. So I'm bringing together findings from various studies that we have conducted across at least 4 resettlement colonies in Chennai over a period of about 10 years, and some insights from comparative studies we've done with Ahmedabad and Mumbai to comment on women's work in these. Now in Chennai, most of the resettlement colonies are built along the IT corridor, which has several IT parks and special economic zones and various high-end commercial and residential developments. Yet these resettlement colonies are in many ways disconnected from the dynamism of the periphery. Now in 2011, about 10 years after the resettlement colony of Kannagi Nagar was established, we conducted a survey of livelihoods covering about 700 households. And we found that the impacts were much more severe on women workers than on men. That is the impacts of the relocation. So for example, of the 288 people that had either lost jobs or abandoned working after the resettlement, 207 were women. Now, so that's in 2011. Now in 2017, again, another study that we conducted in 2 other newer resettlement colonies called Perumbakam and Gudapakam. We found that in the hundreds of households that we sampled, 30 workers had dropped out of work, of which 23 were women. And of course, so therefore many households are struggling to survive now on a single income, despite significantly lower housing costs. Now the reasons are pretty obvious. Most are still traveling to the city for work, as the places they had been relocated to did not offer jobs appropriate to their skills, or because they could not break into the employment markets in the new area, especially since there was so much competition given the large numbers that are relocated together. So they had to travel long distances at high costs, both monetary, but also in terms of time, energy, health. Public transport arrangements were sorely inadequate. unreliable, overcrowded, and costly. Access roads to the public transport hubs, to bus stops, etc., were often unpaved, unlit, unsafe. People with even minor ailments could not negotiate the crowded buses on the long journeys, so they dropped out. Those who had small children and had to be home by afternoon dropped out. Now, these issues of distance and inadequate transport were compounded by the challenges of running a household in a resettlement context with poor water facilities, weak social networks, and a lack of childcare facilities. Gayatri talked about lack of childcare in the slums, but actually, if you see, the slums are a much better situation in terms of social networks and extended families, etc. Housing design in these resettlement colonies plays a role. Houses are designed for nuclear families, and they're so small that they do not allow scope for the spillover accommodation that tends to extend the household unit and to offer extended support in informal settlements. So all of this, of course, make women drop out in very significant numbers. I think that one of the biggest effects we can expect to see in the coming decades from this countrywide relegation of working class people to the urban peripheries is a large-scale removal of women from the labor market. But there are a few additional contributing factors here. First, low rents or housing costs in these settlements, which are quite low because they're on hire purchase, etc., make it possible for women not to work, while the new formal housing represents a notional class mobility. So people feel that now they're formally housed, they're slightly better off, and in comparison to informal housing. This creates more household pressure to keep women out of the workforce. So many women who were keen to work said that their husbands opposed it. Thus, you see a re-domestication of women, partly owing to the reassertion of the patriarchal nuclear family due to tenement design. So I think that's one thing that we see. But even where women continued to work, what we observed was a restructuring of the conditions of women's work caused by this oversupply of low-wage, low-skilled female labor with restricted mobility and very few options, trapped in these large and relatively isolated ghettos. So you're having this sort of oversupply of a certain kind of female labor. So when we began our research in Kannaginagar in 2011, we found that women were constantly asking us for work, which surprised us as there had been a lot of economic dynamism in the area in the 10 years since the colony was built. The IT corridor had developed by then, and a range of jobs for low-income women had opened up. So we were perplexed to see the high levels of female unemployment, to see women from Dalit and fishing communities, typically the most economically active women, sitting and playing cards in the middle of the day. Even 10 years after the resettlement, why were women desperately seeking work? What we found was that the issue was not a lack of job opportunities, but the quality of work available to them. Women's jobs were concentrated at the low-skilled end of the occupational spectrum that we analyzed. So they were in domestic work, housekeeping, cleaners, helpers, office and sales assistants, and casual factory work. They were almost entirely absent from the semi-skilled and technically skilled occupations like driving, plumbing, carpentry, painting, which paid better and were also organized in self-employed or entrepreneurial modes and were more mobile. We also found that the vast majority of women's jobs here were casual, organized through contractors, usually mass teams of them organized under highly insecure and exploitative terms. They were very poorly paid. They had to put in very physically taxing working sort of hours and under conditions where they had to spend long hours on their feet, often not allowed to sit, not allowed to use elevators. Wages were cut for every day of leave. There was harassment by supervisors and very few opportunities for occupational mobility. Now, while these are not uncommon features of informal labor in general, I want to say that the context of the resettlement colony exacerbated these conditions. First, working conditions and wages could be kept low because of the large pool of low-skilled labor available in these mass ghettos, making it a contractor's market. Second, the alternatives like domestic work in the city, which was actually a preferred option for many of these women, was too costly in terms of transport costs and time. So, and I'm just going to close here very soon. What we found was that the quality of work available for women from resettlement colonies, even in the high-end new economy establishments of the IT corridor, caused a high turnover of jobs. Women quit their jobs frequently because they found that their health was suffering or they were not able to balance household and work responsibilities. They were constantly then looking out for new jobs that would be more suitable to their needs. This partly explained the high levels of unemployment and underemployment that we saw. So being employed in the resettlement colonies was a tenuous, shifting, and contingent condition, particularly for women. In fact, I argue that conditions in the resettlement colony produced a phenomenon that I'm calling occupational domestication. In other words, apart from removing women from the workforce due to distance, logistics, and living conditions of these colonies, women also faced forms of domestication in the sphere of paid work. And I would like to talk more about that, but I'm going to save that for the next round. So I'll stop now with this. And yeah.
Thanks, Karen. No, I think you bring in, both these speakers earlier have already talked a lot about domestication in a separate way. You kind of introduced the concept of occupational domestication that's also happening in these resettlement colonies. I'll come to Gayatri, because a lot of what you've talked of and all of you have talked about is the high levels of precarity and high levels of sort of this tenuous employment, exploitative labor. And, you know, Karen, you just mentioned about the spots of, you know, this contractor who kind of takes, what, Gayatri, are you seeing in terms of, you know, maybe a response to this in terms of, or a collective action or collectivization by women of some form? Are you, what are some of the, you know, changes or shifts or movements that you've seen in the settlements or in the migrant colonies that you've been studying?
Thanks, thanks, Sudarsana. So, I mean, to respond to your question about the kind of the forms of collective action that we're seeing, I'm going to draw on work that Aparna Sundar and I have been doing with garment workers in Bangalore. And, you know, having attended a couple of the union meetings initially, right, one of the things that is quite apparent for, is that the kinds of mobilizations and the kinds of discussions are not centered around wages, right? A lot of it has to do, for example, with sexual harassment in the workplace. And that becomes one of the big concerns in the kinds of discussions that we were witness to. But for today, what I actually want to talk about is the protest that happened a couple of years ago when the rules were of the PF were going to be changed. And you saw this mass collective action in Bangalore. Entire roads were blocked. Yes. And interestingly, right, most of the unions were completely taken by surprise. Right? This was a collective action that was created through little WhatsApp groups that almost entirely circumvented the unions. Right? And what we see this as a protest, it was not about wages, but it was a resistance to being rendered precarious. Because what is it that people use the PF for? Right? It's not seen as in its intended purpose as pension. Rather, it is when you have to take a break because your body just no longer can take this repetitive work, right? Or you're laid off, or you have to pay school fees, or you have a marriage or a medical kind of crisis to deal with. That is what you are withdrawing these savings for, right? It's not for some kind of romantic notion of retirement. And so what we saw this as is this very, very fierce resistance to being rendered precarious. And it was directed at the state, but it was directed at the state's compact with capital, right? And challenging that compact and this refusal to being rendered precarious. Now, if you look at the kinds of collective action that have also happened with domestic workers in Bangalore, right? Again, domestic workers, it has been very hard to collectivize and mobilize. In fact, more because of, you know, the obvious reasons of what constitutes the workplace, are these workers, etc., right? And a lot of the mobilization of unions and of labor NGOs has been to go to the residents of of domestic workers. And this is kind of the work that one of my colleagues at APU has been doing, right? And again, here we see also this huge segregation of those domestic workers who are working in gated apartment complexes, where in a certain sense that gated apartment complex acts, they argue, Natarajan and Joseph, they argue that it's almost akin to a factory gate kind of mobilization. But for the vast majority of domestic workers, that is not necessarily the conditions under which they have to operate and engage. Kind of the conditions of their work. So the challenges that labor NGOs and labor unions, because there are all kinds of different organizational actors at play here, have been quite wide ranging. So, I mean, I'm going to.
Yeah, thanks, Gayatri. And Karen, I'm assuming, as you mentioned, that this is exacerbated in these sort of peri-urban locations, because most of these are the IT community, gated communities maybe, but they're also kind of, there isn't this mass mobilization which is really possible or not, I mean. And so we would really like to hear how are these women living in these resettlement colonies, how are they responding to these shifts and challenges that they are encountering? And any thoughts on what we need to be doing?
Yeah, if I may, can I talk a little bit more about what I mean, I will talk about how women deal with this situation, but I want to describe what I meant by occupational domestication, and I sort of saved it up because I didn't want to take too long in the last round.
Sure.
And what I mean, I think by this is, by occupational domestication, is the sort of sequestering of women into spatial and social positions within the labor market that are subjected to lower valuation, reduced mobility, and greater control and surveillance. Kind of like the situation of domestication of women, but this is also happening in the workforce. And to explain this, I want to just bring up again this category of women's work, which I think, you know, people were hinting at in the previous sessions. We know it is a category that links patriarchy with capitalism by marking out a special segment of low-paid, low-status work that is then designated as women's work. And this is made possible by gendered ideologies of women being the secondary or supplementary wage earner for the household. So if this renders women a cheap source of labor through this ideology, this becomes even more so for women who may be lower skilled or lower educated, and also for women of lower castes. So this idea of women's work explains this correspondence between the feminization of work and the feminization of poverty in the current global economy. You're seeing why, you know, this expansion of women's work is also producing more women's poverty. What I'm arguing here then is, when you marry this category of women's work with this spatial restructuring that I was talking about earlier, you get this phenomenon of occupational domestication. This is achieved through three, I would say, interlocked phenomena that mark women's work, especially when you have this abundant supply of ghettoized female labor that I was describing. The first is that the definition of women's work itself involves certain mappings of skill, in which, for instance, cleaning, packing, quality checking, assembly work, all things that women do, are designated as unskilled, and machine operation is designated as skilled. So in our surveys, we found that women's jobs were concentrated at this so-called unskilled end of the occupational spectrum. So a good example would be factory work, which employed several women in Kanagi Nagar. This would be a good example of how this skill is mapped and how it then produces distinction between casual and permanent workers. So in several manufacturing firms, you see machine operators are exclusively men, and they constitute a relatively privileged category of workers that can become permanent. But the majority of workers are casual, and most of these are women, and they face insecure tenures and backbreaking, often hazardous working conditions for less than minimum wages. Several women describe a clear ceiling on upward mobility, where the permanent positions are kind of reserved for male workers. And this is explained or justified in terms of this idea of skill. But the definition of skill remains fairly arbitrary. Most machine operators had low levels of formal education and had entered factory work as unskilled helpers, moving up the production chain to their skilled positions. Women, on the other hand, remained confined to functions that involved low engagement with technology. Many women in our study had worked as casual workers for over 15 years within the same company. In some industries, they were also kept out of the more dynamic segments, such as site work. So women in a furniture factory told us, women are not allowed to leave a restricted area in the unit. So you see how this idea of skill and mobility is sort of rigged, I would say, in favor of men. And a second constituent of this occupational domestication is the settings of women's work, which are typically the realms of service in homes and establishments or behind counters and desks with timings that are flexible. And this flexibility of timing is either through agreements with employers, as in domestic work, or through the absence of regulation, as in casual company work. So this is the sort of settings in which women work. And the third feature of occupational domestication is constituted by these working conditions that we're all describing, precarious, tenuous, etc., that render women's foothold in the labor market quite tenuous, with short contracts, frequent layoffs, job loss, all of this creating a constant traffic between employment and unemployment, between home and work. So you're seeing this sort of, this is the kind of occupational domestication scenario that women in the resettlement colonies are facing. Now, how do they deal with these issues? We're not seeing a lot of mobilizing, unionizing, collective action, etc. But I think what our studies of resettlement of urban working class households in the urban peripheries emphasized for us was the value that women placed on paid work, even while its conditions had become harder, and in some ways the economic need had become a bit less. So here, specifically talking about the Chennai context, many women who had quit working expressed feeling tied down and frustrated, and they kind of outlined for us the kinds of jobs that would enable them to work for at least a few hours a day, both for the sake of their autonomy and control over their own time, and for the extra income. And interestingly, it was paid work in particular that, it was paid domestic work in particular that offered the kind of flexibility that allowed women with household responsibilities to undertake this paid work for at least a few hours a day. Hence, this occupation, which is often seen as demeaning and low status, emerged as a highly sought after and valued occupation by women workers in the resettlement colonies. So women typically tackled these poor working conditions by opting out and seeking change. So there's this high rate of job turnover that we found in our study was not only due to the insecurity of the work and the unsustainable conditions of labor, but was a testimony to women's active exercise of their options and decision-making powers in their working lives. What also became clear was that women made work decisions, as Gayatri was also, I think, pointing out in her talk, on much more than income considerations alone. They took into account health effects, work relationships, hardship levels of the job, convenience of access, and most importantly, flexibility of timings that would allow them to send their children to school properly fed and clothed. All these considerations were important in determining whether women stayed in a particular job or took the job. By moving in and out of jobs for all these reasons, I'm arguing that women played out their side of this relation of cheap and dispensable labor in which they were embedded. So they were also playing this out. Thus, women in the resettlement colonies were not simply subjected to ideologies of family, domesticity, and the household division of labor, or of caste and class, but they actively shaped and negotiated these ideologies, primarily through their participation in the labor market and their constant traffic in and out of it. And what was also clear was that these women almost universally saw themselves as workers, even when they were not active in paid work. Even for those with significant household responsibilities or small children to care for, the world of paid work beckoned strongly, and they believed it was only a matter of time before they returned, often against the wishes of their husbands. For them, the ideology of the housewife was not exclusive of the worker. And it's in paid domestic work, of course, the overlaps between these two identities was a source of skill. This was work they knew how to do. And of course, in this scheme, flexibility of timings was a pivotal enabling mechanism built on the shared ideologies of domesticity and work between middle and lower class women. But it was a costly mechanism, as all wage jobs with flexibility in our study were at the bottom end of the wage spectrum. I just want to say one last thing here about how women dealt with it. I feel that in the workings of occupational domestication, paid and unpaid household work, while finding continuities and overlaps, were not symmetrical or equally valued. For most women who found themselves having to negotiate the two roles, the role of mother housewife seemed to carry priority. Women in Kaniginagar appeared for the most part to be strongly invested in the values of home, family, and most of all of generational mobility, that is, of giving their children a better life by investing in their education. Almost all the workers we interviewed, male or female, expressed strong hopes that the children would study and move out of manual work to office-based white-collar work. This is why their purpose in the city. Women's working lives to a large extent subserved this goal. In some cases, it domesticated them, and in others, it sent them into the labor market. So I think that's really, I feel, what I have to say about how they dealt with these conditions of work in the resettlement colonies.
You know, Karen, I wanted to mention that when you tell us the story of the resettlement in Chennai, I recall, I cut my eye teeth in the grand resettlement program that was undertaken in Delhi in the emergency, and the resettlement colonies were exactly in the periphery. They were in the jungles, they had no facilities, all this. So the first sort
1980s.
of organizations of women, the first organizations of women grew around the demand for civic amenities and so on and so forth in those regions. Of course, this periodic cycle of being displaced within the city has, of course, specificities, because Delhi had a large amount of territory that was nationalized under the DDA, but was not occupied. So there was a lot of squatting. There was a lot of squatting, and squatting meant no rent. So that also supported the low wage system. And then even when the resettlement took place, all these other factors, distance, this, that, all the other was there, except there is one crucial difference, because in a northern state, a city like Delhi, female work participation rates were always very, very low. And even, I mean, it was always predominant, it has always been a migrant city, but it was the small-scale industrial boom that took place in this area from 1960s, late 1960s onwards, was fed by a male workforce, not by a female workforce. There were, of course, exceptions. As I say, there's always exceptions. But I say it's a familiar story. But when we are talking of the current moment, Karen, my own reading of the situation of women's participation, and I'd like Gayatri also to talk about it, is that what we are seeing is a certain dynamic role of women workers in the trade union movement today. And if you look around, firstly, as far as domestic workers are concerned, anybody who has some association with working class movements will know that there's always a timing issue. There's an accretion of a certain consciousness and a moment where things break out. And so if you look at this present moment, domestic workers organizations have sprung up all over. Now, there will be variations. Obviously, the majority of domestic workers are not organized, but you are seeing, which is organic. It is an organic process that is actually, because of critical mass, a certain long-term experience of domestic work also, and even within this precarious and shifting regime, there is a sort of build-up towards organization. And so you can see this emerging across cities in several cities. So there's an assertion, a new assertion that is there. The second thing is, if you look at any working class struggles today or any sections, you see, women are very much in the forefront. And it's a strange paradox that in a situation where that even all female workforces, whether they're domestic workers, whether they're Anganwadi workers, whether they are ASHA workers, or other kinds of all female workforces, have chosen the mixed gender unions as their instrument for pushing their agendas forward. And unlike in the 1970s and early 80s, when it was the women or based trade unions which were in the forefront of all this, today there is a changing situation. So I just feel that sometimes, sometimes our older systems of thought need to adapt to a changed situation. And I feel that this is also true in relation to, and I would actually like to discuss this with you, also in relation to this umbrella concept of the informal sector. Now it is becoming a restriction on our thinking about how class differentiation is taking place, or it's becoming restrictive because it's an umbrella which is not taking us anywhere further in this, in our understanding of actual unfolding social relations and employment relations. And I'd like to also particularly mention, Sudarshana was not at all keen for me to be discussing the labor codes. But I have to say that this is also, there's a political context of a real attack on all sections of the of workers, which is sort of represented and epitomized by the labor codes. And this marks to a certain extent a new aggressive partisanship with capital by the state, and which is a little different from what was happening, let's say, in the 50s, 60s, when the direction of movement was in the other way. Now it is moved in the other way. So there is a certain a new situation, and in that, what are the nature of the alliances that people are going to forge are a question that we also have to address. Is a segregationist line working? I personally think it's not. That's why I just wanted to add this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We've all been, we've been discussing this quite a bit, in fact, at Gender at Work, in terms of the fact that we also tend to work within these sort of silos, and been questioning even how women's rights organization and women's movement have been actually or not working with women labor groups. I mean, there's so many of these partitions, and the alliance building has not, whether it's happening or how is it happening, and possibly not happening in a way that it actually moves us forward, is something that we've been actually questioning quite a bit in terms of our own strategies and our own way of working. So, thank you so much for pointing that out and bringing that up for discussion. I think it needs a discussion amongst this group, but I'd also at the same time would love to hear if the people who are listening to us, if they have any questions at this stage, would love to get a few of their questions in at this point.
Can I just respond? Can I just respond to a couple of things that Indrani was talking about? I think while I recognize that there was a particular sort of scenario of resettlement that happened in Delhi, back in the in the 1970s indeed and 80s, I think we are seeing, for the context of Chennai, I think, and also Mumbai and other cities, it is an emerging phenomenon. And, I would call it sort of a new resettlement, new set of social geographies of the city, because there are particular forms of it, the kind of formalization that it creates, the kind of, ambivalence that these families have, that, they want to move out there and become part of a formal housing thing. On the other hand, they don't want to move out there because it's destroying their livelihood. I think there's a whole set of, tensions in here. And while, I looked particularly also at domestic workers, both in the city and there. And I think, as you say, there's a lot of domestic workers unions and organizing going on. But on the ground, in, for instance, Kananginagar or Perumbakam, etc., you don't actually see it or feel it.
Yeah.
I mean, women are not, you know, they're not, women, I know there are members of the unions, you know, Sujata, you know, some of these, the Pen Toriyalar Sangam members are there, they're living there. But when you interview domestic workers across these things, you know, you don't see the presence of this. So I think these assertions exist, but whether they're making a difference to the broad trend of what's going on in women and work in these sort of large ghetto settings, I think is a big question.
Not yet.
Yeah, and you talked about informality, and I completely agree with you that we need to have a much more nuanced, you know, a take on that. To me, what is emerging is the grip of the contractor in these areas, because you have, you know, because of the sort of mediated access that these women have, or yeah, that women have to markets, labor markets, you know, because when we go in there, they're always asking us, do you know of jobs? Can you find us jobs? So they don't have the sort of ready access to finding jobs that they used to have in the city. So contractors have, and also because they're situated on the IT corridor where there's a large amount of subcontracting of all kinds of labor teams, obviously from housekeeping to security to restaurant service, whatever, everything is subcontracted. So, so to a very large extent, the labor, and especially women's labor scenario here is mediated through contractors who are employing teams and dropping teams. So I think if you see any kind of collectivity here, it is, and contractors are, you know, they're extremely harsh conditions of how they run these, I mean, you know, we're all familiar with that. And so I think one needs to look at the, I mean, we also found that there are different kinds of contractors who, whose, you know, labor arrangements are also very different based on, oops, my chair's fallen down. So that's, I think, part of what shapes this whole thing. And so in many ways, the domestic work became a preferred option because that, very strangely, and for me it was very counterintuitive, but I've written a paper about it which really argues for why women in Kananginagar, given the whole spectrum of work options that they had there, preferred domestic work. And partly it's because it was not mediated through these large contracted teams and gave them more flexibility and more access to, you know, direct benefits from their employers. And the last thing to say about collective action in these resettlement colonies, or the lack of it actually, is that there was a fair amount of alienation of residents in general from these resettlement colonies. There was stigma in the resettlement colonies. There was self-imposed stigma there, so they felt alienated from their neighbors. We're not like the others. So there wasn't a great sense until, you know, often many, many years later, and until some very successful organizing initiatives, you know, years later. People did not readily form associations. People did not readily come together and see themselves as neighbors or collectivities in some form. And I think this definitely, there was a lot of competition for work, etc. So I think all of these are very specific conditions that you see in the resettlement colonies.
Yeah. So I'm just going to, I know there are lots of possibly, you know, questions from the audience who kind of patiently labored through this this panel, but I think I just want to pick up on the point that Karen was making about this challenge to collectivity within the settlements of the urban poor. Now, whether it is resettlement colonies or it is in various kinds of squatter settlements, the threat of eviction that kind of really places a challenge on being, everything seems to be so temporary, right? And everything is so subject to being unsettled very quickly and arbitrarily, that the ability to build connections and to build trust between different groups of extraordinarily marginalized people has been quite challenging. Right? Within domestic work, for example, again, it's not just a work relationship, right? I mean, most people who've been working on domestic work will say that very often it is also because the employer is also seen as a source of credit, which is typically unavailable from other channels. right? So there are multiple ways in which, when we think about the relationship between employer and employee, as Indrani very kind of correctly pointed out, we have to rethink it in terms of we can't kind of continue to stay with these conventional understandings and these contractual kind of understandings that have typically characterized labor scholarship and labor understanding of labor. I think women's labor requires a rethinking and a challenging of these categories of analysis and of action.
Thanks. I think Shakti had a question.
Shakti says, thanks to all the speakers for your fascinating talks. Could you say a bit more about how different types of networks play a role in migrant women's access to and experiences of work and workplaces? And could Karen expand on why Kannagi Nagar residents consider work in the IT corridor more unpleasant or uncomfortable than the work that they did before they were made to move?
I think if she's asking about migrant women, I think it would be better if you and Gayatri come in, and I'll talk about the second part of the question, which is the IT corridor, etc.
Okay, so I'll just pitch in here, just from kind of work on settlements of the urban poor, right? When we look at, and this is, I guess, the point that I was trying to make, is that one of the first tasks that migrant families have to kind of engage in is finding shelter and finding water, right? It is through being able to access those networks of knowledge of how you actually provision yourself on a day-to-day basis that the kind of the broader ability to understand the layout of the city and its possibilities is one kind of dimension that I want us to think about, which is like the residents, the residents of the laboring body in cities is very much part of the understanding of laboring possibilities and constraints in the city. The second thing, of course, is that, you know, the very broad kinship networks that also exist and that have brought communities into cities, and how those kinds of networks are used in order to understand the possibilities available to groups of people. Now, language, particularly in a place like Bangalore, but pretty much every other mega city, right, does pose a challenge to organizing. The kinds, and for example, domestic workers will often say that instead of negotiating for a basic kind of a wage, we'd much rather negotiate those wages on our own, right? So the forms of labor collectivization may not necessarily be around wages. It will often be around the conditions of work, whether it's sexual harassment or it is pension or multiple other kinds of factors.
Thanks. Indrani, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I want to, I want to discuss the question of networks. Now, frankly speaking, there are a range of networks, and it can be, there can be kinship networks, there can be community networks, there can be friendship networks, neighborhood networks. There's a whole range. There's a whole range of networks that are, I mean, processes through which migrants become accustomed to a social life in the city, including in the search for work. And I've always felt that, you know, privileging of one type of network or thinking that this is the way it works is an empiricist fallacy, because it may be in a one particular place, but you'll find in, or for instance. So the fact is, one thing is pretty clear, and this I say this on the basis of the fact that I have at least been associated with a number of working class families for, I mean, for at least 3 or 4 decades in this. And it was always amazing, a matter of amazement for me, that you could go any part of the city, and you could find a connection with somebody who was known through some kind of network in another. Now, it is much more difficult for women. This is much easier and is generally practiced much more by the male workforce. For women, it is much more difficult. And so there's a tendency to saying, but my own experience is that over a period of time, the neighborhood becomes much more significant. If you have a neighborhood, of course, if you're shifting neighborhoods all the time, which may happen, it's a different matter. But this does become far more significant in women workers' lives, their community and their neighborhood. Sometimes they overlap, but that's the way it works. And it includes people like contractors. You know, the manner in which they find their work have to do with a whole series of institutions and forms of labor. And forms of work. It is linked to that. And we need to have a better picture of the totality of it. That's all, as far as the networks are concerned. But there is a process of change. There's a process of acclimatization. There's a process of acculturation. There's a process of adjustment, choice. There's a whole lot of factors that come into play, and conditions. And of course, as Karen says, conditions of work and so on and so forth. This is, of course, an increasing factor that is coming.
Thanks, Indrani. Karen, you wanted to take
the question.
No, it did. And Karen, you wanted to take the second part.
Sure. So yeah, she asked me particularly why Kanagi Nagar residents consider work in the IT corridor more uncomfortable than the work they did before. And I think, yeah, that's not particularly how I would phrase it. I think what I am arguing is that we need to look at women's work in this setting in a sort of a holistic view of what their conditions are, both in their home settings and in their work settings. Both these things have changed. The kind of market in which they're working has changed, and the setting from which they go to work has changed drastically, and put together, those two things put together make it extremely difficult for them. So the first thing to say is that the reason why some of it, even though the IT corridor is offering abundant work, it is offering very low quality work. And I was trying to argue that the reason that the work is of so low quality is because there's a tremendous competition for, well, I mean, you have, you know, about 50,000 women corralled in one space, all, you know, cut off from the city, and pretty much all of the same sort of class. And therefore this allows these high-end companies to push wages and to push working conditions lower and lower through, and you know, again, through contractors. So you do have this sort of contractor Raj. It is their market at this point. And you know, so you have these very large numbers of women in the workforce, and that makes the conditions of work in the IT corridor hard for them. And then, of course, that is then exacerbated by the fact that you have very difficult conditions of childcare, for instance, at home. You have what Gayatri was talking about. For many years in the resettlement colonies, water is hard to come by. Electricity was not there for the first 10 years in Kanagi Nagar, they had to steal electricity, amazingly enough. These are formal housing for the poor. And you know, Anganwadi centers are supposed to be set up, but only a fraction of them get set up. And I'll come to this whole question of eventually things happen. And so these conditions, which are often sort of a little easier in the informal settlement, again, surprisingly enough, make, you know, going out to work much harder. I mean, apart from the fact that you have problems with logistics and transportation, you can't just step out and go to work. You do have to figure out transport. It's expensive. You spend many more hours away from your work. So I think, to me, the whole the difficulty here is quality of work. And low quality of work is made possible by this ghettoization of poor people in large sort of labor supply conditions in these ghettos. So that's one. And of course, the role of the contractor. But the other thing that I wanted to just refer to is to pick up from what Indrani was talking about eventually things sort themselves out. And you find that's the story in resettlement colonies, that eventually over time, 5 years, 10 years down the line, everything gets better. The water comes, the electricity comes, people make friends, the childcare centers come, the primary healthcare center comes, etc., etc. But I think what's really critical in the lives of working women, and I think this would apply also to Gayatri's argument about, you know, the relocation or the dislocation of women when marriage is migration, is that these disconnections are of very high cost to people in the, you know, in these working classes. That it takes in those years of disruption, and this is made very clear by the resettlement experience. In those 4 years or 5 years that they didn't have buses or they didn't have lights or they suffered because of safety problems, you know, they couldn't go to work. It meant a setback of perhaps an entire lifetime of opportunity that they. So young women who dropped out of college or dropped out of school because of the buses being problematic, or dropped out of school in the beginning, may never be able to make up that trajectory in their lifetimes. Or domestic workers who lose that continuity of employment in their particular homes, they can never make up that level of wage when they're starting new in a new place. So I think the sort of continuity of work, the development time that people have put into their careers, let's say, is lost. And when it's broken, it's very hard to put back together. It doesn't. So this thing that eventually things get better is at very high cost to working class people in these places. So disconnection and reconnection, which sounds simple enough, is actually a hugely disruptive kind of a process. And that's why for me the whole argument, and so the whole argument is that housing conditions have to be and people's mobility in these, they have to be in place in order to make a smooth transition of livelihoods for workers.
Thanks. Thanks so much. Are there other questions? Maybe just one. I know. I know. I know Indrani said that I didn't want to bring the labor codes, but maybe just a last thought on that in terms of the work on migration and all of that we've discussed. Very briefly, if there is any reflection on that, because the ordinance has just got passed and we're now in a new labor regime altogether. So maybe just a minute on that, and then maybe we'll close.
I actually, I didn't really also want to discuss the labor codes, because, it's a humongous.
It's a huge thing.
Mean, it is. It's a humongous sort of amalgamation of a whole lot of laws in the most stupid fashion. Also, let me tell you. So it's not. If you actually look at the various elements of the laws and so on, something has come, something has been dropped, etc. There's a certain degree of stupidity involved in the and a sort of lack of attention to detail in the way they have done it. Okay, so that's one element. So it's quite a task to actually even read those damn labor codes.
Right.
But the point that I actually want to really emphasize is that there's a politics to it, because the whole attempt is twofold. On the one side, there's a propaganda offensive saying that, these labor codes are there for the entire working class, whereas actually earlier labor laws were only there for a privileged minority, which is a lie. It's a lie. It's a lying system of propaganda, but what it does represent, and it represents in a summated sense, is a new assault on the rights of workers at all levels. Now, I've never had a very great faith in the labor law enforcement machinery and the way it works or anything like that. But I will say that this is a political offensive, and it's designed to pulverize any kind of attempts to utilize the law for my own assessment is that workers will still organize. They have removed the right to strike. Workers will still go on strike. They can go on saying all these things. But there's another element which I actually see is, and that is there has been an attempt to segregate women's issues out of the labor codes. For example, sexual harassment is not part of the labor codes. It has been kept out of the labor law. It has always been kept out of the law, the labor law. Gayatri was saying that the issues around which women were more concerned, women workers were more concerned, were sexual harassment. I wouldn't precisely agree with that, because I think wages are also an important issue. But what I'm saying is that the gender issues are sort of segregated out of the thing. Now, there's a politics involved in that also. And that's the point that I really would like to make. And I think it is time all of us in our various silos, somebody said silos, or in our various groups have to rethink where are we located in this larger offensive that is actually playing out in our, there is on the one side, there is an entire economic process which is disturbing this thing. There's a policy process which also disturbs, as Karen has pointed out. But there's also this element which is a more direct political intervention. And on that count, we have to take certain stock of where we stand. That's all. That's
and countermeasures as we kind of figure this out a little more. So this will be the last question, and we'll end after this. And this is something that we actually wanted to speak about earlier anyway. But Poehl's question is about, can you speak about the intersections between gender, migration, and the pandemic? Who wants to speak about it?
Can I speak on this?
Sure, go ahead.
I really want to say on this.
Sure.
Okay. I would like to actually draw people's attention to two very striking cases which received national publicity. One is the case of Jamlo Magdam, this young 13-year-old girl from Chhattisgarh. She belonged to the, who died on her return journey from the chili fields in Telangana. I'm presuming most of have read about the case. And the second is, of course, Arvina Khatun's case, who died at the station, in a station, and everybody saw her infant son, Rahmat, trying to wake his mother. Really bring out many things that we have been, at least in our work, we have been trying to point out as one thing is, it should be clear that the male bias in migration was also reflected in the extraordinary return migration that took place. And a recent survey, which was, am I audible?
Yes, you are. You are.
Now you're frozen.
Unfortunately, not audible.
You're frozen.
Yeah.
And they, sorry? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, now you're fine.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So they estimated around 18% were women migrants. Okay, that was as far as after in the post-pandemic, I mean, after the returns, this was their estimation. So women were definitely a minority, and 18%, 18 to 20, 25% is roughly what our estimation is of the world of labor migrants. But Jamlo Magdam was part of an all-female group, who was brought from a small village in Chhattisgarh in the forest region called Ade, with just 37 households. And she was part of this group which went to the chili fields. Now, after she died, what happened? The woman who took her, and was also a co-worker, not the classical contractor, labor contractor who's a non-worker. She was also a worker. She also worked in the chili fields, and she also walked all the way back along with them. She was arrested with the charge of trafficking. And here what you're seeing is that when it comes to gender, and when it comes to women's migrations, and when it comes to women's independent migration, this whole trafficking discourse kicks in such a way. And let me say that, you know, already women are stigmatized for going out to work. There are the restrictions, social restrictions of the village are transmitted to the new stigmatization and confinement. And yeah, and the trafficking method and the emphasis on trafficking actually reinforces this entire process. That's one element. In Jamila Magdam's case, it comes out pretty sharply because this woman who took her was also a worker. There were 10 of them. She was paid 15,000 rupees for transporting 11 workers to that place. Now, contractors are exploiters, we all know. But there are layers and layers of contractors also, and we need to understand and make a differentiation along the tiers. That's one element. The second one is Arvina Khatun. Now, Arvina is from Katihar. She's, of course, a minority. And usually they say, oh, Muslim women don't work, but here she was working in a construction site in Ahmedabad. But more interesting was less attention was paid to the fact that she was married to a man in Bareilly. Now, where is Katihar and where is Bareilly? She was married and, of course, divorced and gone back to her village. But the question is, how was this marriage negotiated? And this is one element in the gender and migration story, which is this cross-regional marriage. Because of a certain set of economic and social factors that are now in play, this element was not explored in Arvina Khatun's case, nor was it about the issues of how a highly corporatized and increasingly corporatized construction sector is allowed to continuously get away with maintaining only a casual workforce and refusing to carry the load of periods of this thing. This question has also not been discussed. So there are intersections between gender, migration, and not just work, but the entire gamut of social relations in which we are currently embedded in the processes that are unfolding. I don't know whether, I just wanted to make these few points because let me say one thing, this trafficking law, now because in the shadow of the pandemic, as you all know, an entirely repressive, centralized state machinery is kicking into action and getting a whole lot of, is getting empowered in a particularly offensive way. And this is reflected in the way the trafficking law was being seen. It's full of surveillance.
Right.
They're sending the police after young women who are migrating.
Right.
How do you support such a system where you continuously put all these young, can you imagine all these world's informers and criminals and policemen chasing these young girls and putting them, and then these child rights NGOs also play a role. But I'll not go into that. But I'm saying there's a draconian hunger to get after various targets. And young migrant women are one of them in this draconian trafficking.
We've definitely...
It's not organized crime, they can go on to...
Yeah.
Well, on the pandemic, sorry, Gayatri, you want to say something first related? And then
no, you go ahead.
Okay.
Okay.
I guess one thing that, sorry. One thing that I think became quite clear to us is that there's going to be, livelihoods are going to be much further decimated in these resettlement colonies, because we know now that the IT companies have seen the money in work from home. So, you know, so where they had, you know, office space for 3,000 people or 20,000 people, etc., on this IT corridor, they're going to be, you know, major shutdowns of these. I think this is going to be long term, because we've spoken to IT executives, and, you know, the cost savings for them are tremendous. While this is perhaps good news for the city in terms of pollution and traffic and all of that, it is terrible news for all of the sectors that serviced these companies there. So, you know, all the way from housekeeping to drivers to, you know, restaurants and all of that. So there's very, very massive loss of livelihoods on that corridor, of which most of the workers were from these resettlement colonies. So I can imagine that there's going to be a very large loss. So I think all of the gains of the IT company is going to spell out to huge losses in terms of people's livelihoods. And I think this is something that if we did have a government that cared, this would be something they would have to pay attention to. And just a second very short point is that once again, we see in this pandemic the kind of unique vulnerability of these spaces because of their distance and dislocation. I mean, sorry, their disconnection from the city. So while, of course, most of the working classes lost their jobs for a while during the pandemic, etc., many tried to make a slow recovery through sort of vending and various other things, even before the economy opened up very, so there was a slow sort of climbing back into something. Whereas I think in the resettlement colonies, because of their dependence on public transport, they could not do anything until public transport opened up, except for people who could, you know, make it on private transport like bikes, which are mostly men. And so you actually had people just basically cut off for 4 months. I know, you know, somebody tried to come here to meet us in that time, and she walked back 25 kilometers to her home in the resettlement colony. So this was, and every time there's a disaster, whether it's a flood or a cyclone or now the pandemic, we see how they're being cut off becomes a huge vulnerability for these large, already vulnerable people there. So I just want to say.
Thanks, Karen. Gayatri, you want to say?
What I'm just going to add here is that apart from the kind of crisis of waged work that Karen and Indrani kind of pointed out, one of the other issues is of treating, if you think of the pandemic as a health concern itself, right? And not just as an opportunity to drive in various kinds of draconian laws, you're seeing the burden of care work that women typically are tasked with has increased exponentially in increasingly constrained circumstances, right? So this has increased the amount of care work that they are expected, that they do. And this itself has, and this is an argument that Madhura Swaminathan has made, right? When we're looking at, for example, what is happening in the rural areas where migrant workers are returning, you're also seeing the kind of the care burden increasing in highly constrained circumstances, economic circumstances, which is actually really damaging to women's health, right? And it's a health crisis that is related to but distinct from the pandemic itself.
Thanks, everyone, for bringing up different dimensions of the impact of the pandemic on migrant women and their relationship to work. We'd like to close now, and so I would like to thank all the speakers for such an enriching discussion. You've all, you know, highlighted sort of the complexity and the relationship between gender, migration, and work, and in relation to the social and economic changes that we are seeing and we're working under, both whether it is the policy or legislative shifts, but also sort of the changes that are being brought about by globalization, urbanization, technology changes, all of those. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining this panel today and for this lovely discussion. And thank you so much, Prajna, for organizing this discussion. This is a very timely discussion. Thanks, Varna, Shakti, and Poehler for working behind the scenes to organize this panel. Thanks, everyone.